Hello and welcome to the last of 5 webinars that have been developed this year in 2018 by the Victorian Department of Education in collaboration with La Trobe University. These webinars complement a live series of workshops that have been held across Victoria for teaching staff, leadership staff and SSS, psychologists, speech pathologists and other support staff to focus on learning difficulties including dyslexia and provide additional support. The agenda for these live workshops that have just concluded and this webinar series, which is also concluding today, are drawn from recommendations from the program from the review of the program for students with disabilities. And a series of 5 webinars are a follow-on opportunity for those people who had the chance to attend a workshop and for those who didn't to get briefed on the sorts of things that were discussed in the full-day workshop. This is the team, including myself, Tanya Seri. Between us all, we developed the workshop materials and presented them across the state of Victoria. Today, with the the webinar on explicit instruction, I'd like to acknowledge the work of Dr. Lorraine Hammond, who has really been the pioneer in explicit instruction among our team. And although I am your presenter, I would really like to acknowledge the work that she's put into helping prepare these slides. For those of you who might have seen some of these webinars before, there may be some things that are said that aren't particularly comfortable or don't seem very palatable to you. It's absolutely fine. Please post any queries if you're online presently, or I can answer any email queries offline as well. For the live workshops that have just concluded, there were 6 main themes that were repeated throughout all of the discussion. They are here. For this webinar today, the themes that I'm really going to pick up particularly are, of course, explicit instruction, which is the main topic, and at a secondary level, evidence-based instructional practices, which underpins everything that is included in these workshops and webinars, and the notion that what I say is important for all students and absolutely critical for those students who have learning challenges. For this webinar today on explicit instruction, these are the topics that I'm going to be covering. First of all, look at the debate about or around instructional approaches, essentially between explicit and non-explicit approaches. We'll then turn our attention to thinking about teaching, which is what educators do, and interventionists, learning, which is what the students do, and how that's all mediated by cognitive architecture of the brain. Leading on from thinking about the brain, we'll talk about the information processing model and cognitive load theory, both which support the value or the importance of explicit instruction. We'll then define explicit methodologies and non-explicit methodologies and talk about the when and why for both. Focus in on the principles of explicit instruction, and I've got some examples that I won't be showing you in this webinar, but some links for you to follow and some resources. And finally, summing up. So let's start by talking about the debate between explicit and non-explicit instruction, both sides of the coin, so to speak. So it can look a little bit like this: at one end, explicit teaching, and at the other end, non-explicit teaching. Explicit teaching might go under other terms such as direct guidance, perhaps direct instruction, but essentially at the core, it's teacher-led instruction. Non-explicit teaching may also go by a number of other names, such as what you can see on the screen: minimally guided instruction, constructivist approach, experiential learning, inquiry learning, and facilitation. From the 5 from 5 website, and if you have seen any of the other webinars, you will know that I've talked about this. They have some fantastic resources to do with a lot around the teaching of reading. They have a specific section on explicit instruction with the web link on the screen. But in brief, they describe non-explicit teaching as a process where students are provided with prompts and are asked to then find out the information by going through a problem-solving process. Explicit teaching, on the other hand, is a process where the teacher does some instructing, some explaining. She or he then does some showing, modelling, and then eventually passes the baton over to the student. So it's quite a different process. But some key premises about teaching, learning, and the brain. It is all about getting information into the brain. Anything that we learn is literally information that is stored in long-term memory. So any instruction, whether it's in school or whether it's about sport or music, anything else, but any type of instruction is designed to alter the learner's long-term memory. The information has to get locked in the learner's long-term memory. If nothing has changed to long-term memory, then nothing has been learned. So long-term memory is absolutely fundamental as one of the key factors involved in learning. Probably comes as no surprise to anybody. Instruction, which is the vehicle for students to learn information, will be most efficient when the instruction is provided in terms of the way that we know how the brain operates and works best to learn new information, which will bring us shortly to talk about the information processing model. So we need to keep in mind how we know the brain functions optimally and take advantage of that in terms of the way that information we instruct students. A key premise for this webinar, and I will support it with evidence, is the following point, that if students aren't learning, then it's argued that they're not being taught. Teachers aren't teaching optimally. And we know that all students, regardless of ability or disability, all students can achieve success when they're provided with highly effective teachers and teaching, supportive learning environments, no matter what level they are on or how they learn. So let's think about the student. You can see in the middle is their brain, and we'll consider what is it that teachers need to teach and what can be assumed knowledge that students bring to the task of learning. And that can be best described by thinking about information as being biologically primary or biologically secondary. So biologically primary knowledge are the generic skills that we, by virtue of being human, acquire effortlessly without being taught. For example, young children learn to communicate, learn speech and language skills, very easily. Young children, well before school, are doing a lot of problem solving and seeking solutions, such as looking for a toy, looking for their bottle, and certainly walking and other gross and fine motor skills are biologically primary. We all learn them without being formally taught. What is really important when we're thinking about the educational context is that these biologically primary knowledge base and skills are essential if students are going to benefit optimally when they go to school for learning. That's to say, in terms of learning difficulties is the aim of these series of webinars. For example, children need to have well-developed oral language skills. Students need to have well-developed social communication skills. Children need to know about story grammar, about the beginning, middle and end of a story and so forth. And these are skills that are acquired effortlessly. No one teaches a young child at school entry every single word in their vocabulary. There's an innate process where we are wired to learn a lot of biologically primary knowledge. So we don't need, in the education space, to be teaching those skills as such. But what is really essential is teaching of biologically secondary knowledge, which refers to the domain-specific skills in whatever area that do need to be explicitly taught. Examples, again, this is a very non-exhaustive list, but for example, learning to become literate, reading, spelling, writing, learning to do various mathematical processes, learning to play an instrument, or learning to become a competent golf player. If no one taught us those elements, we would not know how to do them, or certainly how to do them competently or well. So it's really the core business of educators to teach biologically secondary knowledge so that information can be locked in one's long-term memory. So I'll just now turn for a few minutes to the theory component of this webinar. It's not long, but it really is important to explain or give a justification for what's coming after. And the two aspects I'd like to talk about are the information processing model and cognitive load theory. They tie very much closely together. Some of you may have seen this slide before, but this is a model of the information processing sequence, where if we look at information at the top of the chart, the grey boxes at the top, we receive information through some sensory modality, and then it's sent to working memory, which we know is a capacity-limited system. It only can hold information for a short amount of time. It's averaged about 30 seconds, and only hold a certain number of bits of information, on average around 3 to 7 bits of information. So working memory is very sensitive. We have to treat it with kid gloves. Once it's got into working memory at the right capacity, and students are given a chance to practice, rehearse, put it into some examples, which is essentially the schema development, the information will move horizontally to long-term memory. And that's what we want. That is the learning part. And long-term memory, we know, has unlimited capacity over an extended duration. I have asked some people in my workshops to think of their very first telephone number, so I'd invite you all to think about that now. And if you can, I would also be a bit presumptuous, but assume you probably haven't thought about that for a long time. But for those of you who could remember it, which I imagine is most people who are watching, it shows that even if you haven't thought about it for a long time, you can rustle around the bottom depths of your long-term memory and find your very first telephone number. So information is retained. And because you were able to tell someone your first telephone number or say it to yourself, you were then retrieving it, which is the arrow going the opposite way from long-term memory back to working memory as well. So it's a fragile system where working memory is very much at a vulnerable process, that information, if there's too much presented too quickly, too much time before hearing the information and then practicing it, there's a dotted line to show that it can easily get lost, meaning that information can fall vertically and be forgotten, and that's not going to promote any type of learning at all. You can see the very thick line around long-term memory, that once it's gone through working memory, students have had a lot of opportunity to watch, to be modelled, to have very guided and scaffolded practice. The information will enter long-term memory and it will be retained there over the long haul. If things are not well retained in working memory, for example, the information is too complex, too much information has been provided, students are asked to solve a problem when they don't really have the foundation skills, they're very much at risk of losing what information was put into working memory, which means nothing will be transferred to long-term memory, meaning that nothing is retained and retrieved for later use. As Stanislas Dehaene said, every child is unique, and this graphic indicates that. We all come with our own linguistic, cultural, family, personal backgrounds, but when it comes to reading, we all have roughly the same brain architecture as per the information processing model that imposes the same constraints on learning, and that really refers to the constraints of the working memory and the same learning sequence. So that applies to students who are very able learners and those who have difficulties or disabilities. We still all go through that same process. It's just that certain students need more input for working memory to be most optimal. Schema formation might take a lot more practice for information to be embedded in long-term memory. If we think about working within the scope of anyone's working memory, a student may have task demand or demands and an instructional approach if the task is learning an algebraic process. If the demands of the task and the instructional approach, ideally at an explicit level, are within the capacity load of a student's working memory, that provides fertile ground for learning. So students don't have too much information to hold in working memory. They can practice a small amount of information and gradually that skill will be embedded into long-term memory. If the task demand and the instructional approach exceed a student's working memory capacity, meaning that they're overloaded, the working memory becomes very fragile and things will essentially bubble out and the information will travel vertically instead of horizontally. And that's what we refer to as cognitive overload. We want to manage cognitive load, and by cognitive overload, it means that everything in working memory spills out. The dotted line in this second circle indicates that it's not a nice tight ball that we want information to be held within. And again, some of you might have seen this little slide, but none of us, no matter how able or challenged we are with learning anything, none of us can work under too much load, and we need to think about working memory in exactly the same way. Thinking about education as a general principle, we know, as in any discipline, whether it's medicine, whether it's engineering, whether it's aeronautical airspace, all educational decisions must be based on the best available research evidence. That's going to give us the most confidence for providing the very best information to students. When we think about explicit instruction, the main topic of this webinar today, we know that explicit instruction is based on research studies relating to effective teaching practices. In other words, we know that there is a strong evidence-based base for explicit instruction. Explicit instruction can be challenging, and it is often a sense of going back to the basics and going through a series of steps towards mastery, but it's essentially small steps up and up and up, so building systematically on knowledge progressively. So the information is embedded, and then more information is built on by the progressive footsteps, leading to mastery of the domain-specific skill that the student is attempting to learn and the teachers are attempting to teach. So some students need more help than others, but at all times, if we're teaching new information, explicit instruction is absolutely essential. Let's now turn to defining instructional approaches broadly between explicit and non-explicit examples. And I do note, I've just noticed there, I have a spelling error in approaches, so my apologies, I'll fix that up. What do we mean by explicit instruction? Essentially, it's a process where the teacher provides information, explains, then demonstrates and scaffolds the task, and then progressively fades their scaffolds as they are handing over more and more responsibility for the students to do the task. I will be explaining that in a lot more detail over the next few slides. If we think about explicit instruction, it is going from small amounts of information and then progressively building systematically. So going in with a microscope, getting the foundation skills, and then building progressively on those foundation skills. Barak Rosenshine, the author cited at the bottom of this slide, writes a lot of fantastic information about explicit instruction if anyone is wanting to follow up further. But essentially he defines explicit instruction as a systematic method of teaching with emphasis on proceeding in small steps, checking in regularly for students' understanding, and achieving active and successful participation by all students. So it's a lot of work on the teacher's behalf. There's no doubt about that. The clips that I have got towards the end of this webinar, if you have a look at them, you'll see that teachers are working to capacity as well. But it's a highly systematic, very scaffolded process where teachers are constantly checking in regularly for students' understanding. It involves considerable guidance on behalf of the teacher. And when I say teacher, I guess I'm talking about any educator or interventionist. So the teacher provides a lot of modelling and uses a lot of examples by, for example, showing worked examples of maths problems or spelling examples or examples of a particular grammatical construction. The teacher's also providing a lot of scaffolded practice and corrective feedback. So it's a highly interactive process. And that scaffolding is progressively faded as the teachers physically observe that students learn the requisite knowledge or skill. Nothing is left to chance. Because it's highly interactive, the teacher will always identify when and who has learned the skill or has mastered the skill and who needs some more support. Teachers fully explain the concepts and skills that students are required to learn. Nothing is left to chance. And this is where it's the opposite end of problem solving or inquiry-based learning. Teachers use many examples and many demonstrations. So once again, a lot of output by the teachers. And one of the key things about explicit instruction is that students are not asked to do anything, complete a task, read a book, before they have actually been taught what it is to do. So explicit instruction is highly teacher-led, where teachers have more control and agency over the learning process. Now, many people may listen to this and feel a bit overwhelmed and have thoughts such as, I wasn't taught this. In fact, I was taught not to use this sort of teaching. I was taught that it might be really boring and drill, kill kind of teaching, and it might really stifle my students' creativity. And I'd really like to state here that the evidence does not support this view where this teacher's feeling rather overwhelmed and terrified. So explicit instruction really is quite simply instruction that is concrete and visible. Once again, that notion of nothing left to chance. The teacher explains all new concepts and strategies in clear and concise language that keeps in mind students' cognitive load, not giving too much information all at once, but in small amounts of small chunks. The teacher provides modelling and explanations of concepts and skills and uses many worked examples or demonstrations before students are asked to do the task. Perhaps as the scaffolding is gradually getting pared back, the teacher may ask the students to complete just one element of a worked example, but certainly not going in and having to work out how to go about the particular task. And teachers provide a very high level of support as students practice and apply the newly learned concepts and skills. You can see here one of the key aspects is about skills. This is a teaching instructional approach that is very focused on skill mastery and progressively building on skills that are mastered going to the next stage. On this slide here, I've got 8 types of instruction. Some are explicit and some are non-explicit. I'm going to read each one and give you 20 seconds to determine whether you think it's explicit and non-explicit. None of them are both. I know we haven't talked about non-explicit teaching, but based on what we've talked about and your own experiences, I'd like you to see if you can select which column it should go into. So the first one is allow a lot of time for self-directed learning in the class. I might keep it to 10 seconds because we're going to churn through a lot of time. But for those of you who might be watching not live, you can pause. So this is a form of non-explicit teaching because students are given a lot of self-directed learning time, meaning that they're put in a situation where they're being asked to solve a problem or work it out. The second one, provide a lot of modelling before the students attempt a task. This is an explicit approach because we are giving students every opportunity to get enough exposure and modelling and examples of the task before we are asking them to actually go through and do a task. The third, tell students a lot of information in a lesson. This is non-explicit. Some people might have been drawn to ticking explicit because we've talked about the fact that in explicit teaching, teachers do a lot of explaining, but they're certainly not telling. There's a difference between explaining and highly interactive practice versus telling like a lecture. So that's why I put it into the non-explicit column. The fourth one, ask students to brainstorm ideas. So that fits again into the non-explicit column because students are not given a lot of foundation knowledge. They're asked to try and work out or create connections between information without actually being taught that information. The fifth one, ask students to respond on a highly regular schedule. That meets criteria for an explicit approach. One of the critical things in explicit instruction is a very predictable routine and a very predictable and regular opportunity for students to respond. The responses may be in unison as a class and it may be small numbers of students or a single student, but it's a highly responsive approach, highly interactive approach, on a very highly regular schedule. So students are really primed and know that they will be responding regularly. Sometimes that's facilitated by the use of individual whiteboards where students will write an answer down and ask to chin it. I've got a photo of that coming up shortly. The next one, ask students to solve problems based on a topic of inquiry. That one's fairly self-explanatory that fits into the non-explicit approach because it is about problem solving and inquiry learning as the prompt says. The seventh one, ask students to solve problems once they have learnt the foundational knowledge. So this fits into explicit teaching. Shortly we will be talking about when to use explicit teaching and when to use non-explicit teaching. But in this case, if the teacher is confident that students have the requisite skills to complete a task, do an algebraic equation, for example, then it's okay to ask students to solve a problem, but there will be on-hand scaffolding available going through the steps that the students have been taken through to learn the particular skill if any student has difficulty along the way. And the final one, use worked examples as a means of teaching. So that fits into the explicit column because it's about modelling of the task or the skill before we're asking students to actually do anything ourselves. Your instruction will be explicit if it looks like the following list. There's quite a few bits here, so as I present them in sections, I'd like you just to reflect on your own practices and see how many things you are already doing that meet explicit instruction criteria. And I'd be very, very confident that there'll be lots of ticks going on. But these are the key characteristics of explicit instruction. If you are teaching something new, this is when explicit instruction is most ideal. If you present the learning intention at the beginning of the class and then all of the steps are presented in small chunks incrementally. If you model every step along the way and students practice every step in close proximity to when you have modelled that particular step. If you don't ask students to respond without teaching them first. If you have a predictable lesson plan, because that particularly assists with managing cognitive load, because students don't have to worry about what to do. They know the routine. So all they have to focus their working memory on is to do the task, not to whether they should respond or not. If you deliver a lesson that incrementally builds on what was taught previously so that learning is cumulative, that's explicit as well. If you ask students to respond frequently and in unison at least once every 2 minutes, it's explicit. If you provide more guided practice before expecting students to complete independent practice. If you provide fast-paced and engaging instruction. If you do more teaching than telling. If you engage and motivate your students, and if you make connections with everything that you teach, so making connections with previously learned information, and towards the end of the class, how that will connect to something that's coming in the future. As a simple example, teaching digraphs, if this was the learning intention, you can see here that all of the digraphs are presented, including the 2 versions of the TH digraph. One is the quiet one, as in thin, and one is the louder one, as in the. And they're all presented, and there'll be lots of opportunity for the teacher to say what they are, to look at the letters that make up each digraph, for students to rehearse and practice them, to write them out, and to maybe put them into a word. That's very explicit teaching. All of the complexity is stripped back, and for students who are struggling more than the majority of the students, you might work with just 2 of the 5 digraphs here rather than 5 of the 5 digraphs. Another explicit instruction would be that the NG digraph, the ng sound, never appears at the beginning of the word, and that's a really important foundational piece of knowledge that students can learn, and then the list can go on. Now, if you're doing a minimal guidance, let's think about what that actually means and what that looks like. As opposed to looking at a microscopic level, this time the students are looking top down, so they're trying to work out informational processes or solve problems by being put into the situation and having to draw on their previous knowledge and then trying to construct new knowledge. Essentially, students are provided with partial amounts of information, and they're expected to discover and inquire through the process of problem solving what concepts make up the learning intention. If we take the example again about learning about digraphs, instead of the individual digraphs, we've now got some of the digraphs in words. Got thing, and that actually has 2 digraphs, so that's already quite complex, rash and my shampoo. And sorts of prompts would be things like, can you tell me what the word is? Or have a think about what the word could be based on the context, based on perhaps a picture. Or the words in your spelling list, have a go now at trying to read it or spell it. So once again, the foundations for learning about digraphs is absent because students are expected to construct their learning based on using a whole lot of different information themselves. To put that into further context, if the word shoe is presented for a student to read, if it's a much more of an constructive or minimally guided approach, the student would be encouraged to use multiple cues to work out and read the word shoe. Those multiple cues may be the picture, it may be the context, there might be a prompt such as, does that make sense? Or have a look at the first letter. Now, we know that looking at the first letter of the word shoe is not going to be helpful in any way to read this word because it happens to be a digraph at the beginning, not the letter S. So multiple cues are used for the student to come to the conclusion of what the word is. There's a chance they'll get it right, but there's also a chance they'll get it wrong because perhaps they haven't been taught explicitly about digraphs, or perhaps they've used the picture and they've said boot instead of shoe. And using a multiple cueing approach, that boot would be seen as okay, and then the teacher could then modify it. But we're actually still not getting to the heart of reading the word shoe based on the foundational knowledge one needs to go in with in terms of reading, decoding and reading a word. If, on the other hand, the student has had explicit teaching, in this case about a lot to do with decoding and now digraphs, the word shoe appears in the text. The student has been explicitly taught about digraphs, so there's a very good chance that they will be able to read the word correctly. If in the event the student has forgotten or hasn't quite mastered knowledge about how digraphs appear and sound, the teacher can then go back and scaffold using exactly the same cues that were used to teach students about digraphs. All in all, as I've said on many occasions, far less is left to chance using explicit teaching. I'd like to just present to you a very cheeky look at golf being taught holistically. I'm drawing on an article written by Kerry Hempenstall nearly 20 years ago. He wrote an article a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but talking about how we teach reading using a holistic or a constructivist inquiry-based approach versus a very explicit structured approach. If we were thinking about teaching golf in the same way that we would be thinking about minimally guided reading instruction, it would look something like this. It's natural, no need for me to demonstrate the grip to you. It's best by learning just by doing it. So you'll learn about how to swing, the stance, the grip, and all those things just by actually doing it. Emphasising particular steps is wasteful. You just need to go and actually do it. And improvement in your golf will come from self-regulating. The learner needs to self-regulate, not from specific instruction from the teacher or the golf instructor. So you can see how ludicrous that actually sounds, but he was making a point about the really critical importance of explicit teaching when we are teaching a domain-specific skill or biologically secondary knowledge. Certainly that would lead to only the very gifted becoming golfers if they've just got some natural predisposition, but for the majority of us, we need to be taught to do a particular skill. Now, if you are not being explicit, I'd just like to give you a list of some examples. You'll be lecturing rather than teaching. It'll be very didactic and you'll be using a lot of discovery learning. Very few questions of students are asked because it's more about telling or more about putting students in the situation of working it out. Not checking in regularly for understanding and asking students to complete tasks before they've been taught because the emphasis is on students constructing their own learning. So why explicit instruction? The main reason is because it really manages and reduces the cognitive load on anyone's working memory because all of the instructional steps are very incrementally presented and broken down into small steps. There is ample opportunity for practice and students aren't asked to do anything before they have been taught. And as one teacher commented after he'd been on a 3-day explicit instruction training program, he said, you're actually teaching students what they need to learn rather than hoping they have learned it. Again, it's that notion of we don't leave anything to chance when it comes to teaching students. A question of explicit instruction, is it the same as what's been done in many years gone by, or is it something different? In fact, in the 60s and 70s, explicit instruction or a teacher-led model was the way that students were taught. It just wasn't called explicit instruction because it was in around the 80s and 90s where a lot of debate came in around explicit versus non-explicit models. So this is really a version of reinventing the wheel. To demonstrate for teaching maths, if your brain doesn't have to work as hard on simple maths, things like basic processes or tables, there is much more working memory space to process the teacher's brand new lesson on complex maths. So learning the addition, multiplication tables, having them in rote memory really, really helps. I'm going to skip through the next slide because we're going to run out of time very soon and show you this 60-minute maths lesson for Year 9 students in Term 1 before this teacher had undergone explicit instruction training with Dr. Lorraine Hammond. So each colour represents an element in the classroom. There's a lot of small text, so I'm going to highlight a few key things. First of all, there is 8 minutes in the lesson plan devoted to just getting the classroom settled. That's 8 minutes out of 60, which is a pretty big chunk. Then we have over half of the lesson, 35 minutes on independent practice. So this is an opportunity for students to be doing a lot of their own learning, self-directed learning. and we just have 6 minutes on checking answers. So there's not that much time, just 1/10 of the lesson, on opportunities for corrective feedback or filling in gaps for students who haven't really caught on the first or second or third time around. Now, 2 terms later, when the teacher's class was examined again, the pattern looks quite different. Certainly there is more elements, as you can see, but again, I'd like to point out a few things. Instead of 8 minutes to settle the class, there is now 3 minutes. So that's really very significant downtime when productive teaching doesn't occur, but it's dropped by more than 50% because the students now are in a very predictable routine. We have 6 minutes on a daily review. So what was learned in the last maths class will be reviewed briefly before the learning intention is presented, which is that thin light green line above. Then we have 31 minutes, more than 50% of the class, on guided practice, concept development, skill development and guided practice. So that's over 50% of the class on supported teaching. That's very in line with explicit teaching. And now we only have 10 minutes, instead of 35 minutes, we only have 10 minutes on independent practice. So students are given a much greater opportunity to learn the information, have very guided practice, modelling, worked examples, as indicated by those red arrows, and a smaller amount of time on independent practice because the teacher has considered it now appropriate to give students the time to work on their own. So you can see that with explicit teaching, there's a lot of shifting around of how time is used, and arguably this shows time used much, much more productively at many levels. Here's an example of a 60-minute science lesson also following explicit instruction training for the teachers. Starting with a daily review, and that lasts for 6 minutes, and the teacher asked the students to spell some of the science words relevant to the topic today and reviewing previously learned concepts from last lesson. Then the actual teaching part, students are prepared in total for 4 minutes by presenting the learning objective and activating prior knowledge, so telling students what they're going to learn and reviewing what they learned previously about the topic. The large chunk of time is spent on the teacher presentation. You can see it's broken up into a range of skills around concept and skill development, guided practice, talking about the relevance of where this learning intention fits in, and then some closure. And this is matched with some problems and a process of I do it, I model, then students do it. And then finally, independent practice going for 12 minutes. So again, about 1/5 of the class where students practice what they have just been taught. Both of those, this slide and the previous slide, show a really nice balance of how an explicit lesson might look. Okay, let's think about explicit instruction in terms of when, why, and why not, because it's not an all everyday type of method. When you look at some videos, you'll see that it would be impossible to do it every day, even if it was a good thing. Thinking of the questions we would ask if we are trying to develop a lesson plan that uses explicit instruction or fully guided instruction, the question is, what's the most effective and efficient way to teach students how to do anything, such as things at the bottom of the screen? If we are thinking about more of a minimally guided class where students are doing a lot of self-directed learning, the question the teacher asks is, what activities can I provide for students to come to their own understanding of how to do the various things? But I'd really like to state that it's not an either or, but a question of when. Explicit instruction is really valuable. You literally get most bang for your buck as an educator and for the students when you're teaching something new. Explicit instruction will always be more efficient, more effective, managing students' cognitive load, really picking up on the information processing model, how our brains work to learn when we're teaching new information, when we're teaching to mastery. Non-explicit teaching, otherwise known as many other things, are valuable when the students have got the background knowledge, they're high in skill, and they have a history of success, and they can then go on and solve further problems. The principles of instruction we've talked about quite a bit. I'd like to alert you to this article, which you can download freely online. It's got some strategies looking at how to deliver explicit instruction. I would encourage you to read that. Here I've got some of those principles with some words left out, and I'm going to fill them in for you. You can also see the picture of the whiteboard with students responding. It looks like in this picture they haven't written anything, but that's a really neat way of just asking students to respond very quickly. So we begin a lesson with a short review of the previous learning, present the new material in small steps with students practicing after each step. We ask a large number of questions and check in regularly for understanding. Do lots of modelling. We guide student practice. We don't leave it to them. We guide it very carefully. We're regularly checking in for student understanding, and in doing so, we obtain a high success rate. We provide more scaffolding for more difficult tasks. And finally, we require and monitor independent practice, because ultimately students need to do it independently, and we engage students in a weekly and monthly review. This can be summarised on this slide as follows. It's just presenting it in a different way. So why explicit instruction for teaching new information? Well, we know that it's based on evidence about how we learn biologically secondary knowledge or domain-specific knowledge taken from the information processing model. It really importantly helps us manage cognitive overload and avoid putting students into overload. For example, if we present a lot of information and then ask the students to do a task, they might have already lost a lot of that early information that was said at the start of the lesson. Explicit teaching provides the capacity for teachers to regularly check in and monitor the progress of all students. In that way, we can clearly and very easily determine who is making adequate progress and who might need some additional scaffolding. We never ask students to do tasks that they're not equipped to do, so we're always aiming for high success, and success breeds confidence, and leaves nothing to chance. Common mantra that I've used a lot of times, but I have to give that credit to Troy Very, and those of you who've watched the phonics debate online will know who I'm talking about. Here are some books that might be useful if you do want to read further about explicit teaching, and some YouTube clips that you might like to watch teaching word spelling, digraph spelling, and geometry as well. In summing up, a quote that resonated with me, it's not a research-based quote, but a quote that just resonated. The mediocre teacher tells, the good teacher explains, the superior teacher demonstrates, and the great teacher inspires. In what we've discussed today about explicit instruction, we have discussed the critical importance of working memory and being very mindful of the capacity limits of working memory, and how that's important because we have to ensure schema formation for all students to learn optimally. Schema formation being that practice and rehearsal, effectively the teaching or the intervention. We've talked about the importance of managing students' cognitive load, because once a student's cognitive load is overloaded, they will not be able to process information and it will drop down vertically, which is what we don't want. We've talked about when to use explicit teaching. It's essentially for mastery of skills, but it's not on its own the only way that teaching should be approached. And we've talked about the role of explicit teaching as a means of supporting all students, able students and the students who need more support, to maximise their learning and processing capacity. So thank you very much for your time. You're welcome to contact myself or probably Lorraine in this case if you have further questions. And most of us are pretty active on Twitter as well if you'd like to follow any of us. Thank you for your time today.